Genesis chapter 34 is such an interesting story, especially when you consider the entire narrative of Genesis. If you're familiar with Genesis, you'll know that there's about 8 significant points within the entire book. There's the creation story, there's the fall of man, there's the flood, and then the Tower of Babel. And from then on, the significant points shifts from events to more people. From then on, it transitions to Abraham, of course, then it goes to his son Isaac, and then it goes to his son Jacob, and then finally it ends with Jacob's son, Joseph. Genesis chapter 34 is actually located right in between the transition from Jacob to Joseph, and the Bible is full of chapters like this that how do I explain this? In one chapter or so, it doesn't quite seem to fit in within the narrative of the entire book, yet the author, Moses in this case, thought it was still important to include it. One of the things I find very interesting about the book of Genesis chapter 34 is there's no mention of God at all. If you read it, actually, it's very interesting because while there's no mention of God at all, the characters involved are also they play a role of protagonist at some point in the book. They also play a role of antagonist at some point in the book too. So from reading it, it's very easy to see bits and pieces of yourself within all of the different characters as they play both protagonist and antagonist. What's really interesting about this is that the Bible is what I love about the Bible is it doesn't hide the skeletons in the closet. And as you read this story, what you'll find is it kind of reads like it's a really good Netflix story. There's incredible betrayal, there's incredible greed, there's lust. The ending itself has a twist that you might not have even seen coming, and it's such a good story that it highlights a lot of important information that you need to know about the spirit of lust in particular. That might be one of the reasons why it's missed when when we read the book of Genesis, is because the focus in this book is in this story is particularly honed in to focus on the flaws of each character and how a spirit of lust can expose the way that your our flesh has natural lustful desires. For some of us, our fleshly desire is rooted in the desires of the flesh, whether it's pornography, sexual immorality, or masturbation. For some of us, our lustful spirit is specifically rooted in greed. Some people, the things that you see in your eyes create a state of covetousness inside of you that causes you to sin. Some people, it's actually a bloodlust. Sometimes you become so angry. Anger is a second emotion, and you become so angry that whatever that primary emotion is, you then see red, and all you want is blood, and you're blinded by the perception, the reality of things that are in front of you. And that's why I think this is such a powerful story that needs to be digested. So let's hop right into it. So turn to Genesis chapter 34, verse 1, if you would. It says, "And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land." Now, if you're familiar with the story of Jacob, there's a few things that should immediately jump out to you about this. See, Jacob had 13 children, but he had one daughter, and Dinah was the only one. Most scholars would assume or agree that Dinah was most likely 16, anywhere between 14 and 18 years old. 16 is a general consensus. How do we know this? Well, it's very simple. See, Dinah was born right before Joseph, and we find out in Genesis chapter 37 that Joseph was 17 years old, which meant that in the preceding chapters of the story in Genesis 34, at most Dinah was 18 years old. Like I said, the consensus is that she was 16, but what we know is that she was an adolescent. And this is a really interesting period in her life because as anyone who's gone through this period of transitioning from childhood to adolescence learns is that you in this period of being a teenager, this is where you learn a lot of your social skills. This is where you learn what you're capable of. You learn that not everyone was raised the same way as you. You learn how to interact with people from different backgrounds. And it's a really important time in your life because these social skills will equip you with the arsenal you need as you get older. Remember, our mandate as a believer is not just to be saved, but it's also to be the light of the world. We're supposed to go into the world and become acquainted with the world so that we can bring the world into the kingdom culture of heaven. And in this adolescent period is where we're supposed to learn the skills to do so. Now, this adolescent period for a lot of people is a very what's the word? It's a very important time, but it's also a sensitive time because for a lot of people, this is the first time you find yourself out of the house without the training wheels and supervision of your parents to keep you from all of the different traps that life has set. This is the period where the training that you received while you were under the jurisdiction of your parents should kick in so that you can spot the pitfalls of life and make sure that you avoid them. Unfortunately, we find out what happens when a believer finds himself in the world without heeding the instructions that they should have learned when they were children. This is like going to college for the first time, and you were raised in a Christian family, you went to a Christian high school, and then you go to college and immediately you lose yourself to the world because the world can be very unforgiving to an innocent believer. So going back to Genesis chapter 34, verse 1, right? The first thing we learn about Dinah again is her age in this period of life that she's in. But look at what she's doing. It says in the last part of Genesis 34, verse 1, she went out to see the daughters of the land. Now, that word see in Hebrew is ra'ah, and it translates a lot better to become acquainted with. What it means is that Dinah went out to not just see with her eyes, but to become familiar with the people of the land. She went out to become friends, to know them on a first name basis, to learn their customs, maybe even teach her some of their customs too, which is noble in itself, but it can also be a naive period in your life as a believer, because this is most likely a representation of the first time a lot of believers have to go through the period of childhood into adolescence. Now, the last thing you should know about verse 1 is the land that she was in. In order to understand the land, you actually have to turn back to Genesis verse 33 at the end of it to see what happens in verse 18. It says, "And Jacob," that's her father, "Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is the land of Canaan." So they were in a city called Shechem, but Shechem, the Shechemites all had Canaanite practices. The Canaanites were infamous for sexual immorality. They were infamous for idolatry. They were infamous for worshiping false gods. So now, putting all of that together, let's have a look at verse 1 again, because now this makes a little bit more sense. Dinah, the adolescent, went out to go and see the daughters of the land. She went out to become acquainted with the world because she was now in a position to learn about practices that were foreign to her. And this is, like I said, a vulnerable time for a believer when they find themselves in this position, because the world is unforgiving to a believer when you find yourself outside of the jurisdiction of other believers. Look what happens in verse 2. It says, "And when Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her." Now, Bible stories are not just entertaining, they're also allegorical in nature. See, from a literal standpoint, Shechem was the prince of this country, but from an allegorical standpoint, Shechem represents the rulers of this world. When the ruler of that country, Shechem, saw Dinah, he fell in love with her and he lay with her and he defiled her. What was it about her that drew her to him? This is a prince that can have, you would assume, just about anyone he wanted. Well, essentially, it was her naivety, right? Here into his land is someone that he's seen for the first time, someone looking like a sheep amongst the wild. And when you're a wolf, it's just hard to turn down something that looks like an easy meal. And unfortunately for Dinah, through no fault of her own, she found herself in a position where the rulers of the world took advantage of her. Now, earlier I said the mandate of a believer is not just to be in not just to be in the world, but to make believers of non-believers. And nobody did that better than my dog Paul. Well, I guess you could say Jesus, but Paul was an exemplary example of somebody who did this. In First Corinthians chapter 9, Paul actually gives his secret on how he was able to go to so many different places and gain so many believers without losing track of his identity. Look at what he says in verse 19. He says, "For though I be free of all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more." And then he explains a little bit more about what that means. He says, and to the Jews, I became as a Jew that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, I became under the law. To them that are without the law, I became without the law. To them that are weak, I became weak. What Paul is saying is that he understood that in order to win the world, there's a level of proximity the believer has to get to the world. And that proximity is defined by relatability. It's a lot easier to convict people with love than it is to convict them with condemnation. So Paul is essentially saying that I go into these cultures and I shed a little bit of my identity, just enough where you can look at me as related and we can relate and we can become friends, but not enough where you think that I'm willing to engage in the things that you're doing. And this is super important because as a believer, when you go from this childhood into adolescence, for the first time, you are going to find yourself in the same position as Dinah did. Remember, let's go back to verse 2. The prince saw Dinah, and something about her spoke to him. Immediately, as soon as he saw Dinah, he realized that this was the equivalent of a believer that was out in the world without a clue how vicious the world could get. See, let me explain really quickly something about what I would call the paradox of advancement, okay? Or the paradox of progress specifically is that advancement brings unintended consequences. What that means is anytime you want to advance, whether it's spiritually, whether it's financially, whether it's in your career, whether it's in your love life, there will be unintended consequences that come as a result of it. Take the Industrial Revolution, for example. It was an advancement for the nation's economy, but the unintended consequences were pollution and working. Oh my goodness, at pollution and the culture of working become infinitely worse. Or how about technology? Technology in the last decade or so has evolved at a faster rate than we have ever seen before. More millionaires, more billionaires have been created than we have ever seen before, faster than we've ever seen, younger than we've ever seen. And as a result, what has happened? The wealth gap has only gotten worse. See, advancement brings unintended consequences because anytime you take a new territory, there is someone who has domain over that territory you must contend for. Remember that story in the Bible where Jesus gets on the boat and he says, let's go to the other side. While they're on the boat, they go through the storm. Jesus speaks to the storm, peace be still. And then they get to the other side, and immediately they are met by a man who was possessed by demons under the name Legion. My question is, how did those demons know that Jesus had arrived in their territory? Like I said, advancement brings unintended consequences. Once light steps into darkness, it has this way of attracting the rulers of darkness, and that's exactly what happened to Dinah. She found herself in a position where through her naivety, the ruler of that land took advantage of her. Now, if you maybe you may have caught the theme of lust at the start of this video, because Dinah's small problem here was Dinah had a lust of the world. When you find yourself in unfamiliar territory, you find yourself also a victim of the practices of that territory. Knowing this, her father Jacob must have had a way to make sure that his children knew that we belong to God. We are a holy nation, a peculiar people, a royal priesthood. And if you turn back to Genesis chapter 33, in the very last verse of 33, you see what he does. Let's actually start with verse 19. It says, and he bought a field where he spread his tents at the hand of his children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. So he buys this piece of land for 100 pieces of money. And then in verse 20, he erects an altar and calls it El Elohe Israel. So what he does is he creates a place of worship that centers his attention and the attention of his family. This is the same thing that Paul would do. This is the same thing Jesus would do. This is the same thing a believer should do. Is anytime you intend to contend for growth and enter a new territory, you must establish a home base, an altar that you can use to remind yourself of your divine mandated assignment. That altar should be church. That altar should be community. That altar should be prayer. That altar should be fasting. That altar should be scripture. But you need something to continually remind yourself who you are, because Paul said, I die daily. It is a daily struggle with your flesh, because the lust of the world is seducing. The things the world has to offer will seduce you if you are not prepared for it. And Dinah, as innocent as she was, had to go through this painful period where she transitions from childhood into adolescence, just like any believer will have to go through, because for the very first time in your life, you'll find yourself without your training wheels, and you'll realize just how seductive and unforgiving the world can be. So, entering Genesis chapter 34, verse 3, we see the focus of the story shift a little bit from Dinah to Prince Shechem. So, let's talk about it. Verse 3 says, And his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel and spake kindly unto the damsel. Actually, let's go into verse 4. And Shechem said unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife. Now, remember, allegorically, Shechem represents the rulers of this kingdom. Dinah represents a believer who has just been defiled by the world. And it's really interesting if you look at the order of operations, because in verse 2, it says that he took her, which is just a fancy word for saying that he sexually assaulted her. And then in verse 3, all of a sudden he starts to speak kindly to her. Doesn't that seem backwards? Shouldn't it first be, you tried to speak kindly to her and then you assaulted her? Why was it the other way around? That just doesn't really make sense, unless you consider the way that the spirit of lust infiltrates your life. See, do you remember the first time you watched pornography and you just felt disgusting and you felt gross and you just felt dirty, and you told yourself, I'll never do it again? But then there was that devil on your shoulder, and it told you, hey, listen, man, I'm here for you. Didn't that feel good? Didn't you enjoy that? I did. You seemed like you had a good time. That trauma that your parents gave you when you were a child that you didn't heal from, I'm here for you. That fear of rejection that you can't get over, I'm here for you. That deep desire that you have to be worshiped, I'm here for you. I just want you to realize how much I love you. I may have not done it the right way, but I'm here now, so let's do this thing. Meanwhile, as you're sitting here negotiating with yourself, rationalizing whether or not that was truly love or whether you're tripping, do you see what happens in verse 4? Shechem says unto his father, Get me this damsel to wife. I have talked extensively about spiritual covenants on my TikTok channel, and I don't have time to explain it here, but covenants are a legally binding relationship between two parties. And so, what happens is when a believer enters into a covenant with Christ, we enter under the messianic covenants between us and Christ. But you can also enter into spiritual covenants with evil principalities, because your behavior invites them into your life and it gives them jurisdiction to legally operate in your life. So Shechem is saying, hey, I want to get into a covenant with this woman. Dad, let's go see what the price is. If I can get her to agree to this, then there's no reason why the brothers will or the family should be upset. We just need to pay the price, whatever it is. Have you ever wondered why one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not covet? Just think about it for a second. How often in the Bible do you see somebody get chastised for coveting? The reality is that coveting coveting comes after the preceding action of lust. What you see is people lust, and in their lust they then covet. Lust is a strong desire for something that is forbidden. Coveting is you willing to sin to obtain something that belongs to someone else. So lust leads to covetous behavior. Lust or coveting teaches you to accept shortcuts and do whatever is necessary to accept results. So Shechem had this entitled mentality because of his uncontrolled lust of the flesh that had finally come out in this verse to be exposed as the way that he defiled Dinah. We know we don't even need to, the Bible doesn't need to tell us that this was clearly not his first experience with sexual immorality, because there is no apologetical text about how he felt. It's simply just, we did it, so let's at least try to make the best of what we've done. See, lust and coveting behavior, it clouds your judgment and your ability to make effective decisions. Because what you do is you start to get into this thinking that the end will justify the means. It's okay if I make my money immorally. I'm still gonna tithe. I'm still gonna use it to help the poor. And that's a problem because any seed that is sown into the kingdom of God with lustful practices is unacceptable to God. It doesn't work that way. You can't steal, you can't use money that you earned selling drugs to then tithe and expect God to bless that. It's putrid to God. See, the thing about lust is that one of the ways it clouds your judgment is it fools you into thinking that no price is too high to pay. The thing about sin is that it always keeps you in bondage longer than you thought it would. It always asks you to pay a price that's more expensive than you plan to pay. And it always hides the price to look like it's something that's cheap or almost free. Have a look at what it says in verse 12. See, at this point in the story, uh, Prince Shechem, King Hamor, they're meeting with Jacob and his brothers to discuss the situation and discuss what it takes to marry Dinah to Prince Shechem. And King Hamor throws out this offer, and before Jacob can even respond, look at what Prince Shechem says. He says, "Ask me never so much dowry and gift, and I will give according as ye shall say unto me. But give me the damsel unto wife." For a man with undisputed resources, no price was too high to pay to cover his sin. He was willing to pay whatever it took, and he made sure that they knew about it. Sin always costs more than you intended to pay. It keeps you in bondage longer than you intended to pay. And when it comes to collect, it comes way in a completely different way than you expected it to come. Have a look at what it says in verse 19. It says that after they come to an agreement, the young man deferred not to do the thing because he had delight in Jacob's daughter. This is referring to Prince Shechem. He was more honorable than all the house of the father. So after he comes to an agreement with his with the sons of Jacob, he immediately goes out and acts on the agreement. See, the agreement that the brothers had said was, "Why don't you just become circumcised and we'll give you our daughter?" That was the counteroffer to him saying, "Hey, I'll give you whatever you want." He's thinking dollars, cents, you name it, we can afford it. It's nothing to us. So when he hears that all he has to do is give up his body, he's like, "That's easy. I've been doing that my entire life." As a matter of fact, he looks at his dad and he probably yanked him out of that tent, ran into town like, "Those idiots, we got one up on them." Little did he know that when it was time to collect, he was not going to be able to pay the price. In my experience, most people don't understand how generational curses work at all. See, most people think that if one parent was poor, and then the reason the child was poor is because the family is cursed with poverty, and so on and so forth. If one parent is predispositioned to anxiety, then the child will be predispositioned to anxiety too. And in some cases, that's true. Scientifically speaking, we do know that a lot of infirmities passed in the blood, but spiritually speaking, it doesn't quite work that way. As a matter of fact, the reason most people think that comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 20. So turn with me to verse 5, where it says, "Thou shalt not bow thyself down to them." This is God referring to bowing down to idols. He says, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." This is also reinforced in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 9 to 10. It says again, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." Bar for bar, it's basically the same thing. And so the interpretation of that is that if one parent serves a false god, then they will be cursed, or if one parent does this, then they will be cursed, and the children all the way to the fourth generation will be cursed. And that goes against the very nature of God, because one of God's defining attributes is justice. God is just. So if one parent sins, then he will not punish the child for that sins. Instead, let's actually break down, let's go back to our text in Genesis 34 to understand how generational curses work a little bit better. So after verses 3 and 4, the story then shifts to now introduce us to King Hamor, the father of Prince Shechem. Actually, if you turn to the preceding chapter in verse 33, we first meet King Hamor in a financial transaction between himself and Jacob. Look what happens in verse 19. It says, "And he," referring to Jacob, "bought a parcel of a field where he spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money." So there was a financial transaction, which was the first time Hamor was introduced to Jacob. Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. Hamor had a lust of the eyes. Greed was ultimately his downfall. He saw dollar signs because in comes Jacob, this walking economy with all of this livestock, all of these servants, all this money. And Hamor immediately thinks, this could be mine. I just don't know how, but there's an opportunity for me to get this somehow. And we don't quite know what conspires, but we do know that when the opportunity came for him to marry Prince Shechem to Dinah, he must have saw this as an opportunity to finally increase his stature. Look at what happens in verse chapter 4. Shechem says to his father Hamor, "Get me this damsel to wife." And so in verse 6, Hamor then goes out to Jacob to commune with him, and Hamor makes an offer to Jacob in verse 8 and 9. He says, "The soul of my son Shechem longeth for your daughter. I pray you give her him to wife, and make marriages with us. Give us your daughters, and we'll take your daughters." And then in verse 10, he says, "Ye shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade therein, get your possessions therein." Did you know what was missing there? No apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done at all. Just very simply, let us make an agreement so that we can continue to work together. Note what he makes, that the offer that he makes in verse 9. He says, "Give your daughters unto us and take our daughters unto you." Jacob only had one daughter. It was Dinah. So what is he talking about? Maybe he's talking about the servants, but but the reality of this is that the bulk of the offer here was to increase the wealth of King Hamor, and there's a reason why you can see the lack of response from Jacob. Remember, Jacob already had an experience with a greedy man with his uncle Laban, so we are sure that Jacob knows this offer stinks. I'm livid. You haven't even acknowledged what you've done. And then in your greed, you have the nerve, the audacity to come here, act like everything's cool, and pretend like we can make the most out of this. You must be crazy. Because after the brothers counter offer with the offer to circumcise themselves, King Hamor doesn't also say, "Why would we do that?" He says, "You mean it means more to you for us to be circumcised than all this money that I'm trying to put in your pocket?" Shouldn't that have brought up a red flags? I mean, if the offer is too good to be true, newsflash, people, it always is. If it's too good to be true, that's because it is. So in verse 21, King Hamor then takes the offer back to the men of the land, and he explains this to them. He says, "These men," referring to Jacob, "are peaceable with us." I bet there was more added. He probably said, "These men are idiots. They're peaceable with us. They could have taken up arms against us and they would have lost, but they're peaceable. Let's let them dwell in the land and trade therein. For the land, behold, is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters for us to wives, and let us give them our daughters." And then in verse 22, he says, "Only herein will the men content for us to dwell with us, be one people. If every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised." And I'm sure some of the men of the land would have said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You want me to cut what off my wear?" I mean, she Dinah is pretty, but she's not that pretty. I mean, why don't you do it to yourself? They say, why would I have to do that? And that would probably explain why in verse 23, Prince King Hamor justifies what he says. He says, "Shall not their cattle and their substance and every beast of theirs be ours?" Do you see the greed that was almost just spilling out of the vial of his mouth? He says, "Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us." So let me explain to you how generational curses work and how they're passed on from one generation to another. See, what really happens with generational curses is that one parent has behavior that's abnormal. And as the child grows up in that household, abnormal behavior starts to become normalized to the child. And so when the child grows up, they absorb that abnormal behavior, and then it becomes very much a part of who they are. So let's put this back in context. King Hamor had a lust of the flesh that was expressed through his eyes, his greed, his covetousness for money. And Prince Shechem grows up in this family where nobody can tell them no. Everything that they want is theirs. And so Prince Shechem absorbs this lust of the flesh, but his desire is expressed through his act of sexual assault. So you see the generational curse passed down from one family to another, not because God cursed them, but because of their lack of reverence for God. This is actually much better explained in the book of Ezekiel chapter 18, and it starts in verse 5. And if you read all the way through, what this explains is that God says, if a man is just and he does this and he does that, I'm not going to visit my sins upon his son, or I'm not going to pass punishment onto his son if his son chooses to act a different way. Or let me say that differently. If a man is just and his son acts differently, then what happens to the man is going to be different than what happens to the son. Generational curses work when abnormal behavior gets inherited, and then that abnormal behavior then gets expressed from one parent to another, to the child. So, as we near the end of the story, once again, we see the focus shift from Dinah to Prince Shechem to King Hamor, now to Jacob and his family, but specifically the brothers. Turn with me to verse 13 to see the first thing we learn about the brothers in this context. It says, after King Hamor had made his offer, and then Prince Shechem had thrown in his additional offer, it says, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father deceitfully and said, because he had defiled Dinah their sister, verse 14, and they said unto them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one that is uncircumcised, for that were a reproach unto us. Verse 15, but in this we will consent unto you, if ye will be as we be, that every male of you be circumcised. Verse 16, then we will give our daughters unto you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. And then finally in verse 17, they say, but if ye will not hearken unto us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughters, and then we will take our daughter, and we will be gone. And like I said, Prince Shechem and King Hamor, hearing this, immediately leave the tent because they're ecstatic. The offer they've received is too good to pass up, and they want to make good on it before anyone realizes what's happened. But the brothers knew something that King Hamor and Prince Shechem didn't. I bet when they made that offer, everyone in that tent of Jacob's family must have had a light bulb moment, because whoever made that kind of proposal knew what was going to happen. See, circumcision was a sign of the Abrahamic covenant. It was essentially how you could identify someone that had separated themselves to be part of God's descendants. And so to ask Prince Shechem and King Hamor to be circumcised without explaining the meaning of circumcision would have been a very odd thing to do. See, the reason why you had to cut the foreskin off of your flesh was because our flesh is the one thing that prevents us from being holy and righteous before God. And for most, if not all men, the part of the flesh that prevents us from doing this just so happens to be the part of the skin that you cut off. And so the cutting of the flesh symbolized a man's dedication to act as holy as possible with his member and his flesh in front of God. So why would he have Prince Shechem and King Hamor do this when they didn't explain what it meant? Well, the answer is actually given in verses 25. It says, and Hamor and Shechem, or excuse me, it's actually in verse 20, yeah, verse 25. And it came to pass on the third day, when they were sore, that two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword, and came upon the city boldly, and slew all the males. So the circumcision was a plot to incapacitate the men. Praise God that I was circumcised as a child, so I don't remember what happened. But all I know is that as the skin starts to scab at some point during, I don't know, day 3 to 6, it's got to be one of the most painful things that any man can go through. You have to just lie there on your back, essentially with your legs spread, probably drinking alcohol or taking whatever the equivalent of painkillers are, so that you can forget just how painful what you're going through is. You need a way to numb the pain. And in this vulnerable state, Simeon and Levi came into the city and killed all of the males, and they did it as revenge. But what's interesting to note is that they were the only two brothers that came. Remember, I said there were 12 brothers, but only two of the 12 of them came. What happened? Well, this is a really, really interesting point. And if you read verse 26, it says this: they slew Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went out. So, the reason why this whole circumcision plot was given to begin with was out of necessity. Have a look at verse 26 again. It says, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house. After she had been sexually assaulted, she was still abducted. This means the brothers couldn't just leave. They needed a way to get her out. So, that proposal of circumcision, as deceitful as it may have seemed, it was not fueled by lust, it was fueled by desperation. However, Simeon and Levi, their act was fueled by lust, bloodlust. So the brothers themselves were innocent. It was Simeon and Levi whose lust of the flesh caused them to act in a manner that defiled their judgment. How do we know that this defiled their judgment? We'll have a look at verse 30, because once their father finds out what's happened, look at what he says. He says, ye have troubled me to make me stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and I being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me, then I shall be destroyed in my house. The brothers didn't think about what this was going to do to the entire family, themselves included. Remember, they were in Canaanite land. They were just in one city. In order for that entire family of foreigners to leave, they were going to have to go from city to city to city. And once word spread of what happened, they were going to be a walking lake. That much wealth with justification to come after you, it was over. And look what the brothers say in response to this when Jacob brings it up in verse 31. They said, should he deal with our sister as a harlot? I already said the problem with lust is the way, or one of the problems with lust is the way that it judges your, it clouds your perception and ruins your judgment, your ability to make sound decisions. It fools you into thinking that the price that you're going to pay is something that you can pay, and it's not a price that you can afford to pay. It considers you to think it, or it destroys you, it fools you to thinking that you can, the end will justify the means. As long as you get the result that you're looking for, it doesn't matter how you got it. Jacob never forgot this, because in verse 35, Jacob prays to God, and what God does is he creates this reputation of the family as they move through. And the reputation is something like, listen, this family of like 13 or 12 men and one old man, they slayed the entire Shechemites. They're coming through our town. Let's just lock our tents, mind our business, and let them go through. Honestly, we don't even need revenge on the Shechemites. I never really liked Shechem anyways. He was kind of a weird dude. Hamor was a greedy guy. Let's just let them pass through. So God creates this reputation that saves them from the inevitable destruction that would have come because of what Simeon and Levi did. But like I said, Jacob never forgot this, because on his deathbed, Jacob is now prophesying what's going to happen to his children. And when he gets to Simeon and Levi, look at what he says in verse 5. He says, Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their inhabitations. Verse 6, O my soul, come not thou into their secret, for unto the assembly mine honor be not thou united. And then he explains what he means. He says, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they dig down a wall. Verse 7, cursed be in their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. All of the brothers were receiving some type of prophetic blessing, well, except for I guess Reuben, the oldest brother. But Simeon and Levi, they were cursed too. Jacob never forgot what they did, and he knew that he couldn't bless them because their bloodlust was as such that if he gave them a prophetic blessing, it would ruin them. The generational curse would continue because their behavior would pass on to their children and their children and their descendants. Funny enough, Levi actually gets a pretty good blessing through all of this, but the point being that the way that lust operated in this entire story was pretty consistent, and it was by clouding the judgments of every single person. It may have manifested differently for Dinah by clouding her judgment with her lust of the world, as it did for Prince Shechem by clouding his judgment with a lust of the flesh, or King Hamor, lust of the eyes, or the Simeon and Levi with a bloodlust. But it did the same thing, and everyone paid a price that they weren't willing to pay.